Welcome to Executive Dysfunction, the show about the fuck-ups, foibles, and flailing of political leaders throughout American history. I'm Amanda Nelson, amateur historian and political obsessive. This season of Executive Dysfunction will cover 5 topics, or content pillars if you want to sound like someone who has a media strategy: partisanship, corruption, class war, attacks on the Constitution, and elections and voter suppression. If you're listening to this in 2026, I bet you can guess why I picked those topics. The show is not limited to presidents. We will be talking about cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and governors, because the executive branch does not have a monopoly on being a disaster. And we are starting today, Season 1, Episode 1, with elections and voter suppression. Because we have never had free and fair elections in this country, and I want you to understand that before we get into anything else. The story I'm about to tell you is not an anomaly, and it is not ancient history despite what my kids tell me. And the people who did it mostly went on to have perfectly comfortable careers. America does have a habit of letting powerful people off the hook. So let's talk about the time the Supreme Court of the United States stole a presidential election. And it wasn't even Donald Trump's fault. To start, we need to meet the 2 men at the center of this, the candidates for president in the election of the year 2000. Al Gore was vice president for 8 years under Bill Clinton from 1993 to 2001. He was a former senator from Tennessee, son of a senator, Ivy League educated, stiff as a board in public, and genuinely one of the most qualified people to ever run for office. He'd spent his entire adult life preparing to be president. He cared deeply about the environment at a time when nobody in politics really thought that was worth caring about. He was also famously not great at being a human being on camera.
I would like to demonstrate for you the Al Gore version of the Macarena. Would you like to see it again?
He was kind of wooden and overprepared. Some might say disciplined. That was a joke about Kamala Harris. The press corps never took a liking to him, and in 2000, that still mattered, especially to Gore, who was through and through an institutionalist. He didn't inspire admiration from his supporters, and had a cast of supporting characters in Florida who were not terribly close to him, in contrast to the guy behind door number 2, George W. Bush. Governor of Texas, son of a president, George H.W. Bush. Grandson of a senator. He had spent most of his pre-political life being a spectacular underachiever with an extremely useful last name. He'd owned a baseball team. He had run an oil company into the ground. What Texan hasn't? He had a DUI that his campaign successfully buried until the final days of the election.
Now, Governor George W. Bush responds to questions from reporters on his drunk driving arrest in 1976. His brief comments were made yesterday on the campaign trail in West Allis, Wisconsin.
Well, thank you all. Obviously, there's a report out tonight that 24 years ago, I was apprehended in Kennebunkport, Maine for a DUI. That's an accurate story. I'm not proud of that. I oftentimes said that years ago, I made some mistakes. I occasionally drank too much, and I did on that night. I was pulled over. I admitted to the policeman that I had been drinking. I paid a fine, and I regret that it happened.
He was charming and plain-spoken, and very good at making people feel like he was the guy you'd want to have a beer with, which in American politics is often more important than knowing anything about anything.
That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can.
All right.
What about the Dingell Norwood bill?
All right, we're going to go now.
I'm not quite through. Let me finish.
All right, yes, go.
His pitch was that he was a compassionate conservative and a uniter, not a divider. Sure, buddy. It's important to know, because the Bush campaign certainly did, that no Republican had won the White House without winning the state of Florida since Calvin Coolidge in 1924. Florida was the ballgame in the election of 2000. Everyone knew it. Both campaigns knew it. The Bush family definitely knew it. because one of them was the governor of Florida. That's right, Jeb Bush, George W.'s brother, was the sitting governor of the state that would decide whether his brother became president of the United States. The two men were effectively running to be president of one state, and only one of them had a brother in charge of it. And over the next almost 40 days, from Election Day until the Supreme Court ruled, Jeb would help his brother win the closest presidential election in the modern history of the Electoral College.
Good morning again, and we begin this morning in Jacksonville, Florida, where Florida Governor Jeb Bush is standing by. Governor, thank you for coming by.
It is a joy to be with you.
Let me begin with this question. Why is George Bush in Florida, of all places, this close to the election? After all, you're the governor down there. Everybody thought he had a lock on that state. What happened?
Well, not everybody. Ask Bill Clinton, who carried Florida in 1996. And since then, our state has changed. We have a lot of new people coming into our state, a lot of people that actually leave. And so, you know, every election's different. And we've never felt that it was a lock. We've worked very hard from the beginning, and we're ahead now because of that. And I think in the end, you're going to see Florida in the column. I'll tell you what, it's a little frustrating every morning to walk up and not have it be in the same color as all those other red states, though. So we're going to make sure it happens.
But before we even get to Election Day, you need to know about two things happening in Florida that set the stage: the Elian Gonzalez crisis and the voter purges. Elian Gonzalez was a 5-year-old Cuban boy who had survived a boat crossing from Cuba after his mother drowned at sea. He had relatives in Miami who wanted to keep him in the U.S., but his father in Cuba wanted him back. Or so he said. There are theories that the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro, forced the father to try to get Elian back for PR purposes. The Clinton administration, after a legal battle led by then Attorney General Janet Reno, returned Elian to his father by taking the kid from his family at gunpoint. The Cuban-American community in Miami was furious, like white-hot, livid. They called it a betrayal. There were marches and clashes with INS, the immigration department that would eventually become DHS and ICE, and of course with the local police. They called the deportation a capitulation to Castro, and they had a name for what they were going to do about it at the ballot box: el voto castigo, the punishment vote, or the revenge vote, pointed directly at Al Gore, who was the sitting vice president under Clinton and therefore the easiest target. Miami-Dade Mayor Alex Pinellas, a Democrat who should have been organizing Cuban-American support for Gore, instead went to Spain. He literally flew to Spain for 12 days. He left Al Gore standing at the altar of campaign events. And that mattered because Florida's Cuban-American community, which had historically leaned Republican anyway, now had a very specific grievance against Democrats. And Florida, as we said, was going to be very close. But here's the thing about Florida being close. Republicans, led by George W.'s brother Jeb, were already making sure that it wouldn't be too close. And they were doing that through voter purges. Eventually, the price Gore paid in Miami-Dade for Clinton's decisions around the Gonzalez case would be clear. Gore's margin was only 39,000 votes in the county, while Clinton had won it in '96 by 107,000. Now, about those voter purges, in the lead up to the 2000 election, Florida conducted a purge of its voter rolls to remove people who reportedly had felony convictions, because Florida, like many states, disenfranchises people convicted of felonies. The state hired a company called Database Technologies to create the list of voters to be purged, and from the jump, there were problems with the list. The company told Florida officials that the list would have false positives, that it would flag people who hadn't actually committed felonies by using a broad date of birth range instead of exact date of birth matches. And it was the same with the names on the list. The list of people to be purged included people whose names kind of matched existing felons, but not exactly. Maybe they had a different middle initial or spelled their names a little differently. And the Florida Division of Elections lawyer, named Emmett Bucky Mitchell, because of course it was, who headed the purge effort, responded to this concern with a quote that I want you to really internalize. He said, and this is not a paraphrase, "We wanted these lists to be fairly broad and encompassing." Broad and encompassing. What that meant in practice, at least 15% of the people removed from the voter rolls were innocent of any crime. 12,000 voters were labeled felons who should not have been. Almost half of them were Black voters, and 93% of the people in that group had voted for Democrats in previous elections. How many votes would Jeb's brother, George W. Bush, go on to win Florida by? 537. And the conviction dates on the list, some of them were in the future. They blanked out conviction dates on purpose because including them would have made it obvious that some of the people being purged had not even been convicted yet. This was perhaps a response to the mobilization of the Black Get Out the Vote effort in 2000, which was supercharged in response to Jeb Bush's One Florida policies that ended affirmative action in Florida. Then there were the 2,800 ex-felons from other states who had moved to Florida, people who had completed their sentences in states where their voting rights were automatically restored, meaning they were legally eligible to vote. Jeb Bush ordered them to be purged from their voter rolls anyway. Now, who was overseeing all of this? Who was the Secretary of State of Florida responsible for administering their elections? Katherine Harris, who was later discovered to have accepted $20,000 in illegal campaign contributions from an insurance company, for which her campaign manager was named as a co-conspirator in trial. Katherine Harris, who had campaigned for Bush in New Hampshire, and was also the co-chair of George W. Bush's presidential campaign in Florida. The person running the election in Florida was also contributing to the campaign of one of the candidates, the older brother of the governor who she worked for. So that takes us to election night. This is November 7th, 2000. The networks call Florida for Al Gore based on exit polls and sample swingy precincts, basically on vibes. NBC called it at 7:49 p.m., CBS 30 seconds later, and then ABC. All, notably, before the polls had even closed in Florida. Gore is going to be president because everyone knows Bush doesn't really have a path without Florida. And then the networks take it back, one after another. Florida goes back into the undecided column. The night drags on, and it becomes more and more obvious that something is wrong with the count, and that it's going to be too close to call, and that somewhere mistakes, plural, are being made. And then, in the early hours of November 8th, the networks call Florida for Bush, including Fox, whose decision desk was being run by George W. Bush's cousin. Gore called Bush to concede without consulting his staff in Nashville, who were responsible for monitoring the counts. And then Gore's campaign staff gets a few calls from on-the-ground staff in Florida who tell them that there are problems with the ballots. Hey, Al, don't get in that car. Do not go to that podium and make that concession speech. His staff frantically catches him just before he takes the stage to make his speech, and they stop him. They tell him, the margin is only 1,700 votes out of 6 million cast. Under Florida law, that triggers an automatic machine recount. So Gore calls Bush back and unconcedes. Just kidding. Awkward phone call. When the machine recount is done, the margin has shrunk from 1,784 votes to just 327 votes. And now Democrats want to do what you do when the margin is that razor thin, right? Count the ballots by hand. But Gore's legal team wanted him to request a manual recount of every single county in Florida. That's 67 total, so that they could build this case that you needed to count every vote. But Florida law didn't allow for a candidate to request all counties hand recounted at once. So instead, he'd have to wrangle with 67 different boards of elections. Campaign attorneys didn't like this idea because it was risky. Those boards could just say no. It was going to be chaotic. They could lose momentum, blah, 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 blah. Instead, they recommended that Gore only focus on counties where the boards would probably say yes to him and where they were most likely to find votes. They played it safe and requested hand recounts in Volusia, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward County. This would be a complete, colossal, fatal mistake. Not just because it undermined his whole vibe of count all the votes, but because it allowed the Bush campaign to build a case that recounting only some counties emphasized the votes of Democrats over Republicans. And this is where things get completely insane and off the rails. Let's talk about the ballots themselves, because some of them were a disaster. Palm Beach County used what became known as the butterfly ballot, a design where candidates were listed on two facing pages with punch holes running down the middle. It was designed by the county supervisor of elections, Teresa Lepore, whose only professional experience was in the Palm Beach County Elections Office. It had large print to help elderly voters read it more easily. It was a genuinely good intention, and it had a genuinely catastrophic execution. The design was so confusing that an estimated 3,000 people who intended to vote for Al Gore and his Jewish running mate, Joe Lieberman, accidentally punched the hole for Pat Buchanan, a candidate who the largely elderly Jewish population of Palm Beach considered an anti-Semite. Because he is an anti-Semite. Pat Buchanan himself said the Palm Beach numbers didn't make any sense, and that those votes were probably meant for Gore. By the end of the day, 19,000 butterfly ballots were spoiled and not counted. 29,000 total were tossed in Palm Beach for being overvotes, meaning more than one presidential candidate had been selected, or undervotes, where no one was selected at all. And then there were the 27,000 votes thrown out in Duval because of a separate ballot design issue. Voters were instructed to vote every page, but presidential candidates were split across 2 pages. So thousands of people voted for a presidential candidate on page 1 and then voted again on page 2, making their ballots invalid. Of those 27,000 thrown out votes, 16,000 came from precincts that voted 98% Democratic. 9,000 came from majority Black precincts. Altogether, 175,000 ballots across Florida went uncounted, either because of overvotes or undervotes where the punch didn't go all the way through the paper. That was called a dimpled Chad, and those of you who are alive at the time will remember hearing that term over and over again, or hanging Chads. Dimpled Chads are ballots with voter intention that couldn't be read by the machines because it didn't punch all the way through. And then there were those hanging Chads where the punch had only perforated a portion of the ballot. Moreover, the initial automatic recount triggered by how close the election wasn't actually done. Supervisors of elections were told by the state that they were required to do an automatic recount, but they didn't tell them what that meant or how to do it or what counted as a recount. 18 counties didn't recount their votes at all. They just re-added up their tallies. Those counties held 1.58 million ballots. The Bush camp would hammer over the course of the saga that Gore was asking for repeated recounts, but the reality is they never fully completed the first one, and they knew that. And during the manual recounts, the Republican Secretary of State's staff interfered. In Palm Beach, an employee of Harris's convinced the election judge present at the manual recount to change their standard for what counted as a vote. They had been using the sunshine standard, very Florida. If you could see sunshine through the hole punched in the ballot, they counted it. Harris's office implied to the judge that a stricter standard was required, and that only those hanging Chads could be counted, not dimpled ones. The recount restarted. If they had continued with the more lenient standard, Gore would have netted over 700 votes, far more than the 537 votes that Bush ultimately won with. George Bush's brother's government continued to work for him. While the hand recounts are being organized, Jeb Bush's legal staff and aides quietly transitioned over to working for his brother's campaign's recount operation. Big law firms in Florida quietly started citing conflicts of interest to avoid working for Gore. None of them wanted to risk angering the governor by working for his brother's opponent. Secretary of State Katherine Harris announced that she would not extend the deadline for counties to submit their vote totals, denying a request from Palm Beach County that they needed more time to complete their hand recount. The Democrats sued. The Florida Supreme Court ruled that the certification deadline had to be delayed and that the recounts could go forward. So the observers watched, right? The process was underway. And then the Republican operatives manufactured a literal riot. It's now known as the Brooks Brothers Riot. This was Republican congressional staffers flown in from Washington, D.C. on Jeb Bush's older brother's campaign's dime. They showed up at the canvassing board in Miami-Dade and staged a loud, aggressive demonstration that stopped the hand count there. This was not like a spontaneous uprising of concerned citizens. These were professional political operatives in khakis and button-downs banging on doors and shouting until the count stopped. The same thing happened in Broward County. Current Trump ally Roger Stone was there, coordinating the riots via walkie-talkie. Democrats, however, were told by the Gore campaign to stay away, including civil rights activist Jesse Jackson, who would come to Florida to ensure that the votes of the Black community were counted. Gore wanted to portray the recount as a legal process instead of a political one, continuing to play a high road game that would lose him the entire war. The news of the Republicans literally rioting to stop votes from being counted should have been headline news everywhere, But that evening, news broke of potential Vice President Dick Cheney's fourth heart attack, which the Bush campaign lied about, saying that he was hospitalized as a precautionary measure. After the riots stopped some of the manual recounts, Katherine Harris certified the election results and gave the votes to Bush. The Florida Supreme Court then ordered a statewide manual recount. Republicans appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court issued an emergency stay, stopping the recount by a 5-4 vote. And then on December 12, 2000, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the varying standards used to count ballots across Florida's counties violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This handed the election to Bush. Florida couldn't finish the count in a consistent way. The election was over. Bush won by 537 votes.
Wrong.
Those 537 votes included 680 overseas absentee ballots, mostly from the military, that Katherine Harris certified, even though they had been postmarked after Election Day, or came from voters who were not registered in the counties where they were submitted. Now, about those Supreme Court justices, Antonin Scalia had two sons working for law firms representing the Bush campaign during the recount, including one that argued the merits of the recount in front of the Supreme Court. After the recount ended and Bush was inaugurated, one of his sons received a top-level appointment as legal counsel for the Department of Labor. Clarence Thomas's wife was actively involved in reviewing candidates for Bush administration appointments. Sandra Day O'Connor had reportedly told people at an election night party that she was upset at the prospect of Gore winning because she wanted to retire under a Republican. And she had spread conspiracy theories that the Gore campaign had illegally registered voters in nursing homes. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had written in a draft of her dissent that if there was an equal protections issue in the election, it was in the treatment of Black voters. Scalia wrote a memo saying she was using, quote, Al Sharpton tactics, which is, of course, a racist dog whistle. Ginsburg backed down and took out the correct racial analysis from her opinion. The court was so aware of how bad the ruling looked, how obviously it would invalidate every other election in the country if applied consistently, that they actually wrote into the decision that it was limited to this election only. They said explicitly that this ruling should not be used as precedent. The Supreme Court issued a ruling that it told everyone not to use as precedent. Creating precedent is kind of their only job. Al Gore instructed his staff not to publicly trash the court, and then he conceded. Katherine Harris was sued over the discriminatory voter purges, and investigators identified voters who had been wrongfully purged and restored their rights. Eventually. The number of wrongfully disenfranchised voters was more than enough to have changed the outcome of the election. A Department of Justice investigation found that 3 Florida counties had failed to provide language assistance to voters, a violation of the Voting Rights Act, which back in the year 2000 still mattered. In 2002, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, replacing punch card and lever voting machines with touchscreens. Which, great, perfect. The solution to the butterfly ballot was to switch to a system that was going to have its own completely different set of problems a decade later. Like, say, Russia trying to hack it every 5 seconds. Thankfully, after 2016, almost every county moved away from those systems to systems with auditable paper trails. 98% of precincts in America now have paper trail systems. George W. Bush's first 2 appointments to the U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C. Circuit were Miguel Estrada and John G. Roberts, Jr., lawyers who had helped his campaign with litigation during the recounts. Estrada was filibustered in the Senate, but Roberts eventually became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
I, John G. Roberts, Jr., solemnly swear. I, John G. Roberts, Jr., do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States, that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
So who really won? Well, it kind of depends on the standard you're using. According to the joint post-election study from USA Today and the Miami Herald, if dimpled ballots were allowed in a full statewide recount, Gore would have won by about 390 votes. If the tougher Palm Beach standard was used, he won by a little less, 299. Under the strictest standard, hanging chads only, no dimples, Bush wins by only 97 votes. It's a lot of ifs, but the TLDR is Not including the purged voters and counting only ballots actually cast, Gore wins in about half of the scenarios. But in reality, the winner was obviously Gore. To quote Jeffrey Toobin's book on the race, Too Close to Call, and ignoring his Zoom scandal here, no one seriously suggests that 3,407 people intended to vote for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach County. No one believes that thousands of Black voters in Duval County had no preference in the race for president. Katherine Harris went on to serve 2 terms in Congress before running for Senate, losing, and then largely disappearing from public life. Jeb Bush served out his term as governor and then spent 16 years biding his time to run for president and getting absolutely destroyed by Donald Trump in a primary.
Please clap.
All those Brooks Brothers rioters, they went back to Washington after having stopped votes in a Democratic county from being counted. And they continued their lives as staffers at the RNC and 2 Republican members of Congress. And America moved on, like it always does. Al Gore asked for too little, and he waited too long. Because Al Gore is the kind of guy who concedes to television networks before consulting his own campaign staff, and who trusts that institutions will do the right thing, even when they are actively not doing the right thing. Here's what I want you to take from this. The 2000 election was not stolen in the dark. It was taken apart in the open. The voter purges were documented. The conflicts of interest were not anybody's secret. The Brooks Brothers riot was on TV. The Supreme Court's reasoning was so shaky, they told you not to repeat it in any other election. And the lessons that Democrats apparently took from this, the lesson that Al Gore himself modeled, was be gracious, be institutional, trust the process, don't fight too hard. You don't want to be seen as a sore loser. There are higher values than winning. Those lessons were wrong.
Almost a century and a half ago, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who had just defeated him for the presidency, "Partisan feeling must yield to patriotism." I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you. Well, in that same spirit, I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country. Neither he nor I anticipated this long and difficult road. Certainly neither of us wanted it to happen. Yet it came, and now it has ended, resolved as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy. Over the library of one of our great law schools is inscribed the motto, "Not under man, but under God and law." That's the ruling principle of American freedom, the source of our democratic liberties. I've tried to make it my guide throughout this contest, as it has guided America's deliberations of all the complex issues of the past 5 weeks. Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
Gore won over 50 million votes, second only at that time to Ronald Reagan's 1984 landslide. And side note, Ralph Nader got 97,000 votes in Florida. If only a fraction of those voters had moved to the Gore camp, he could have won. So you fight, you ask for the full statewide recount. You do not assume that the people who are actively undermining democracy are going to stop undermining it if you just appeal to their better nature. The people who ran the Brooks Brothers riot understood something that Democrats keep having to relearn. Democracy is not self-executing. It requires people who are willing to defend it loudly, publicly, without apology, messily. We are still learning that lesson, and we can learn it better by getting and staying involved in fights to fight voter suppression and secure our elections right now, today. Thank you so much for listening. Executive Dysfunction is produced by Find Out Media. Please like and subscribe. You can also subscribe to my Substack, Amanda's Mild Takes, for early access to episodes. And next week, we will be back to talk about corruption. We will meet notorious swindler Mel Weinberg and the multiple members of Congress he sent to jail. in the ab-scam scandal of 1980. Fiend!
Please clap.